Let's start with reviewing some of the concepts we learned in the previous video. If you could turn to this diagram in the course spec, and we will label it together. So this is mid-sagittal view of the brain, and you're basically cutting it in half, and we're looking at the right half of the brain. So there is your corpus callosum again. We haven't really talked too much about it. So far we have been using it as kind of like a landmark to help us identify things. So I'm just going to color it here for you. We're going to put a label for it. It is the corpus callosum. Okay, I'm just going to put it right here. Now, once you've located the corpus callosum, below it you will be able to see the lateral ventricle. Okay, so this is going to gain access into the lateral ventricle. We don't have label for it, so I'm going to add one for you. Lateral ventricle. Okay, and remember the lateral ventricle is actually more like a C-shaped structure, and there's a little bit of a tail there, and majority of it is embedded within the hemisphere itself. Now, at the walls of the ventricles, you will have these spongy structure. So there is one. There is another one here in the third ventricle. There is another one in the fourth ventricle. So all these spongy things, they are called the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is where you will find ependymal cells that will be making CSF. So contains ependymal cells that make cerebrospinal fluid. Right? So in the lateral ventricle, in the third ventricle, and here we have another choroid plexus. Okay. Over here we have the third ventricle. Just gonna color that for you. Right there, that's the third ventricle. And here we have the fourth ventricle. Right? So let's label that. Third ventricle. Fourth ventricle. Right? And again, you can always tell it is the fourth ventricle because of the triangle shape associated with it. Connecting the third and the fourth ventricle is going to be the cerebral aqueduct, right? Which is this thing right here, cerebral aqueduct. And flowing out from the lateral ventricle, the CSF will go through the interventricular foramen. Foramen means a hole, right? So that hole will allow the CSF to go into the third, and then into the duct, and then into the fourth. Okay? So from the fourth, is going to flow down into the central canal of the spinal cord. There's no label there, but I'll put one here. It's basically, you know, it's going to follow this space all the way into the central canal, okay, which is within the spinal cord. All right. I'm going to add a few things here into this diagram. Let's choose a pink color right here. So you can see this is basically fused together, right? And then it's going to separate into two other layers. Okay, so that is, you probably can do a better job in coloring than me. It's a little bit hard to do on the computer, but these are the dura mater. Okay, so dura mater are typically stuck together, but at the top of the head, that's where they will separate to form this space. Okay, so that is what C is. C is the dural durovenous sinus. Okay, so again, it drains excess CSF, right? Drains CSF back into circulation. And the two layers that makes up the durovenous sinus is going to be the dura mater. So that's the dura mater, that's the dura mater. Dura mater. You can't see it here, but I'm going to add the pia mater for you. Okay, pia mater is going to be following the contours of the brain. Right? We labeled this earlier in another diagram. So just going to follow the brain like this. Okay. There we go. And it's going to actually continue to do so, you know, down here as part of the spinal cord as well. So I'm not going to go through the whole brain. You can do that. But that layer that we just add in, that would be the pia mater. Pia mater. Okay. Now between the pia mater is going to be the arachnoid layer. So I'm going to draw the arachnoid layer for you. Okay. It's going to be these spider web looking things. Okay. And you can go all the way around. Okay. I'm not going to do that to save some time, but you can go all the way. Right. So these things, the blue stuff that I just drew, they are the arachnoid mater. Of course, the arachnoid mater is going to have the subarachnoid space, which would then be filled with CSF. So together, these three layers makes up the meninges. Okay. I'm gonna use a light blue here to shade in the CSF. So that's where the CSF will be. Okay. In the durovenous sinus to be drained in the subarachnoid space. And basically, anytime you see an arrow, that's where the CSF is going to be. Okay, so there's the CSF. It's going to surround the entire brain, giving it buoyancy. Right. Of course, it's going to be filling up the third ventricle and the fourth, but I cannot, you know, color another color on top of them. But basically, they fill them up as well. And then there is the lateral ventricle. Okay. So this arrow, it's pointing at the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, creates buoyancy, floating force that would protect the brain. Okay, CSF here as well. So that's the diagram that summarizes everything we've learned up to this point. Let's take a look at the spinal cord here. We can see that there is the cervical section, which represent the neck area. We have the thoracic section, which is where the chest area is. And then we talked about the lumbar section. That's where you do the spinal tap. And you can see by the time you get down to the lumbar section that the spinal cord is kind of frail out like a ponytail. And that's why it was okay to inject a needle between L3 and L4 to get a sample of the CSF, for example. And even further down, we have the sacral region, and that's all the way at the bottom, even lower than your lower back. Let's take a look at the internal structure organization of the spinal cord. Here we can see a cross section of the spinal cord. You might remember we talked about the white matter and the gray matter, and for the brain, the outside is mostly gray matter, and on the inside it is white matter. But for the spinal cord, the organization is reversed. We have the white matter that forms the periphery, the outside, and we have the gray matter that forms the center of the spinal cord. This is a transverse section of the spinal cord, and you can see you know, it's kind of pink because it was stained that way, but typically this is where the white matter is going to be, and it actually does have a whitish color, and in the middle you kind of see a shape of a butterfly, and the butterfly is kind of upside down right now. So the top of the butterfly is going to be the front of the spinal cord, the anterior portion, and the bottom of the butterfly is going to be the posterior and the back of the of the body. And in the middle of the spinal cord, you can see there's a tiny hole here, and that is the central canal. So if you remember our discussion on cerebrospinal fluid, that's where after the fourth ventricle, that's where the CSF is going to drain. It's going to go into the central canal, and the central canal is going to run the entire length of the spinal cord, starting at the cervical section all the way down to the lumbar and sacral region. So let's go to our workbook, and we're gonna draw a diagram that will help us understand the organization of the spinal cord. If you could go to your workbook, and we're gonna go back a few pages here. There, question number 5. You can see this is a cross section of the spinal cord, and we are going to add some things to it, some labels and some additional information. But let's work with what we have first. We talk about how the outside of the spinal cord is going to be the white matter. Okay, so right there, this region, the outer region, that's where the white matter is going to be, and it's white matter because it is composed of myelinated axons. These are bundles of parallel axons that will be running up and down in the spinal cord, and of course parallel bundles of parallel axons in the central nervous system. We call them tracts. Okay? In the center, we have the butterfly that we mentioned. So the bottom of the butterfly points to the back. So this would be the posterior end of the spinal cord, and this would be the anterior end. Okay, and the butterfly is made up of gray matter. So you can think of the white matter as something that would transmit information, whereas the gray matter is for processing information. So in the previous lecture, we learned about the flow of information within the nervous system. Let's think about that scenario where you touch a hot surface, right? So we know touching the hot surface is going to trigger action potential that would travel through the sensory neurons all the way to your central nervous system. So I'm gonna represent that path with a blue line, and so the sensory information is going to enter through the posterior end of your spinal cord. Okay, so this blue line here, that represents the afferent pathway, and you might remember the afferent pathway carries sensory information, and it's made up of many sensory neurons, right? So it's not a single axon here. I remember the drawing we had last lecture. There are actually a bunch of neurons connected together, but for simplicity, I'm just going to represent it with a single line. Okay, so this line here is going to be carrying the sensory information. Right? In this case, the sensory information would be you touch a hot surface, you're burning your hand. Okay, so that information is going to travel to the spinal cord, and what happens is within the gray matter, the sensory pathway is going to make a synaptic connection with the interneuron. Okay, remember, interneurons are only found within the central nervous system, and interneurons are found in the gray matter of the central nervous system. So here we have a bipolar interneuron. It's going to be processing that information, and if there is a motor command that needs to be sent out, it's going to make a connection with a motor neuron, which would then send the information out at the front. Okay, so sensory information always enters at the back of the spinal cord, whereas motor output is always going to be exiting at the front of the spinal cord. So this is going to be carrying the motor command, and it's going to go all the way to the effector, which is a gland, an organ or muscle that's going to be carrying out the motor command. In this case, it will be the hand to remove from the hot surface. So this path is called the efferent pathway. Okay, and it's of course made up of motor neurons, right? So this is kind of the same thing we learned in the last lecture, but now we actually put it in reference to the spinal cord. Now, even though the paths kind of enters, the sensory path enters at the back and the motor paths exit at the front, once outside of the spinal cords, these two nerves are actually going to be bundled together in a single fiber. Okay, so remember, these are nothing more than parallel axons, and once they're outside of the spinal cord, then we would call them nerve, right? So you remember we have 12 pairs, 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Those emerges directly from the brain, and we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which emerges directly from the spinal cord. So this would be considered as one of those 31 pairs of nerves. Okay, so within that nerves there are both afferent and efferent pathway. It's like a telephone cable. If you split it open, there is one for receiving sound, and then there's one for transmitting sound, right, from what you're saying, right? So in that sense, this is very similar to that. Now, another thing that we want to add to this diagram is as the sensory informations are coming in and continuing in this reflex arc, part of that information actually will split off, and it will travel through the white matter at the back of your spinal cord. Okay, so at the back here, we have a bunch of tracts which will be going up to the brain. Okay, so these tracts, they are going to be called the ascending tract. They're going up, right? So ascending tract, and the ascending tract basically will be taking information up to the brain. Okay, to the brain. So we're going to come back to this concept later, but as you go up to the brain, somewhere along the way, you are actually going to cross the midline, and that information is going to end up in the opposite side of the brain. You probably have heard of people say your right brain controls your left side, the left side of your body, and vice versa. And this is pretty much what that is about. If you burned your right hand, that information will travel up the spinal cord, and at the brainstem, it will cross the midline, and then it will get projected onto the left side of your body. So once the information is processed by the brain, then you might have some motor function that will be coming down from the brain. So from the left side of the brain, it's going to come down, and it's going to be traveling downwards at the front through these descending tracts. Okay, descending tracts. So the spinal cord is organized in a way that sensory information will be going up to the brain through the ascending tracts located at the back, whereas motor information is going to be coming down in the descending tracts located at the front. The sides are kind of a bit of a mix. There are both ascending and descending tracts on the sides, so don't worry about that for now. Just know that ascending sensory information at the back, and motor information will be coming down at the front. So that's pretty much the organization of the spinal cord and the kind of information that it carries. Let's take a closer look at this diagram that we have here. So let me do the same thing in this diagram. Let me just change the color. So we will have the sensory information, sensory neurons, again coming in from the back, right? And it's going to have a portion. Okay, a portion of the sensory neuron is going to be found in the gray matter. Okay, and then within the gray matter, you are actually going to have the interneuron that we talked about, the interneuron, right? And it's going to process the information before deciding what the appropriate actions are going to be, and then that command is going to get sent out like that. Okay, so in the gray matter we have the entire interneuron, and you're going to have a portion of the sensory neuron that's going to make the synapse with the interneuron, and then there's going to be a portion of the motor neuron that's going to be making a synaptic connection with the interneuron. Here we can see that when the sensory information comes in at the back, you're gonna have the reflex arc that we talk about. But another thing that we discuss is that there is going to be these ascending tracts that are going to be going up to the brain. So as it goes up, there are several relay points, but it's going to be crossing the midline at the brainstem. You might remember we talked about the medulla oblongata. That's part of the brainstem. That's where 90% of all the tracts are going to be crossing the midline, and then it's going to go up. It's going to hit a few other relay points, but ultimately it's going to get projected to the left side of the body. Okay, so in case you're wondering, left and right are again flipped because we are looking at this from the front. Okay, so I'm just going to read this to you. Ascending tracts take sensory information to the brain, and it's generally located at the posterior white matter, whereas the descending tracts, they take motor information from the brain, and they're generally located at the anterior portion of the spinal cord. Now, if I give you a cross section, a transverse sections of a spinal cord, you should be able to tell where is it from. Okay, so remember there are the cervical section, right, C1 to C8. There's the thoracic section, right, T1 to T12, lumbar section, sacral section, and typically what happens is as you go down the spinal cord, the percentage of white matter is going to decrease. You can see all the way down at the sacral region, at the lower back region, there is a very, very small percentage of white matter. That's because if you think about coming off from the brainstem and into the cervical section, you have all these axons, okay, all these ascending tract and descending tracts from all throughout the body. But as you go down the spinal cord, these tracts are going to exit, right? It's going to go exit and maybe connect to the arms, and then when you go down further, right, some more are going to exit and connect to the rib, to the thoracic region. So by the time you get down to the sacral and lumbar region, much of these white matters would have been exit already, and you don't have a lot of tracts left at the bottom. Okay, so I probably won't give you something too tricky. I'm just going to give you something very obvious. Like if I give you this section versus this section, you should be able to tell me that this is from higher up in the spinal cord, and this is from a lower portion of the spinal cord. Reflexes. Let's talk about reflexes for a little bit. Reflexes are basically autonomic response to a particular stimulation or trigger that will happen without conscious thought or learning. Okay? So all these things are kind of hardwired into our body, and for the most part, they are protective mechanisms that are required to maintain an internal balance, to maintain homeostasis. Okay? They keep internal organs functioning within normal bounds, and they protect the body from external harm. So there are two categories of reflexes. Those that involves the brain, we call them cranial reflexes. These are going to be carried out by the one of the 12 pairs of the cranial nerves, whereas the spinal reflexes are going to involve only the spinal cord. So actually before that, let's talk about some examples of cranial reflexes. Okay, so some examples of cranial reflexes would be things like swallowing. When a baby is born, no one ever taught the baby how to swallow. They just kind of know how to swallow, and that's basically is a reflex that involves the brainstem. In fact, it involves the medulla oblongata. And it occurs again without conscious thought or learning. It's hardwired into our body. Coughing reflex, that's another one that involves the brain. Cranial reflex. There is vomiting, for example. That's actually a reflex. And a lot of the reflexes that involves eye movements are going to be involving the cranial nerves. Okay, so for example, if you see a flash of light all of a sudden in the corner of the eye and then your head turned, that would be an example of a cranial reflex. Spinal reflexes, there are several that we are probably quite familiar with. We learn about touching a hot surface in the hand, removing from it. That's an example a spinal reflex. Another one that you probably have seen in cartoons and stuff is the knee jerk reflex. There is a tendon here at the bottom of the kneecap. It's called a patella tendon. If you tap on that, what's going to happen is that's going to create a knee jerk reflex. Okay, the signal is going to tell your quadricep muscle to contract, and it's going to tell your hamstring muscle to relax, and as a result your knee is going to kick forward a little bit. Okay, so this is actually a good example of where a single stimulus is going to trigger two types of synaptic communication. You are going to have excitatory neurotransmitter here telling the quadricep to contract, and you can have inhibitory signal here that tells your hamstring to relax. Remember, one must contract, the other must relax. Otherwise, if they both contract, then your leg is basically going to be locked in a particular position, and it's not going to be able to move. Another example of spinal reflex is what we call the Babinski reflex. So some reflex you will keep throughout your life. Okay, so for example, swallowing reflex. Okay, you're going to be able to swallow as a baby, and you're going to be able to swallow when you are older. Okay, all the way until we die probably. Okay, so some reflex are going to be permanent. Right? Another example of a permanent reflex is if you try to move your hand to a baby's face, they might blink their eye, and if you do it to an adult, they are also going to blink the eye. Right? That's another example of a permanent reflex. However, some reflexes, they are going to disappear as we grow up. So one example is if you put your finger into a baby's palm, they are going to grab it. Okay, it's called a grasp reflex. But of course, when we grow up, that no longer happens, right? So the Babinski reflex is another example of a reflex that disappear when we grow up. When you try to stroke the bottom of the feet of someone who is 2 years or younger, their toes are going to fan out like this, and that should disappear after 2 years of age. And what happens is if you do that in an adult, and their feet fans out like that, then that's actually a cause for concern, because it might indicate that there is some kind of spinal injury. So there is the all the things that we're going to talk about for a spinal cord for now, and we're going to move on to the brain next.